I'm Dave Breakenridge, and this is Under the Dome. The holiday travel scandal continues to linger for Alberta Premier Jason Kenney and the UCP. People are still talking about how members of Kenney's caucus traveled abroad during the holidays. This despite the government advising people not to travel during the COVID-19 pandemic. And most didn't. According to a recent Leger survey, about 68% of Albertans didn't visit family or friends over the holidays. That's the highest compliance rate in Canada. Kenney's flip-flopping over punishment for MLAs who did dare travel also sparked anger from all sides.
What I said then was that I didn't think it was reasonable to impose sanctions, given that I had not been sufficiently clear to absolutely ban and say there would be consequences for traveling abroad during the pandemic. And but what happened over the weekend is last weekend I heard very clearly from Albertans about their anger, their disgust, their frustration, and their understandable demand that there be real serious consequences. So I listened and acted accordingly.
And now criticism is not only coming from voters and critics, but from within his own party. Our guests today are David Staples. He's a columnist with the Edmonton Journal, and Ryan Jespersen. He's host of Real Talk, and that can be found at ryanjespersen.com. So guys, the news that UCP staffers, MLAs, and ministers traveled to sunny locales over the holidays, it broke 2 weeks ago. But the anger about it still lingers, and we're seeing that it's even causing potential rifts within caucus. Ryan, why do you suppose it's sticking around as an issue?
Well, I think it's sticking around as it depends on who you talk to. If you talk to those that have perpetually opposed this government, or those that have a personal axe to grind, or let's say the Premier of Alberta rubs them the wrong way, this is just a continuing storyline, one of a spirit of entitlement. Some have gone so far as to use the word corruption, a lack of consultation or meaningful emphasis being placed on regulations that this government itself has put in front of Albertans. If you talk to people on the more sympathetic side to this government, including, I think, sort of freedom-loving conservatives, I think that they're ticked off because they feel betrayed by a party that is starting to, or maybe now undeniably, exhibiting some of those same entitlements that led to a pretty significant political shakeup in Alberta 5 years ago. That would be my general synopsis.
Mm-hmm. David, what about you? Why do you think that this, is kind of hasn't really gone away yet for Jason Kenney and the UCP?
Because there's a major kind of fault line in the Conservative Party. It always exists. As Ryan suggests, there was two parties not so long ago that Kenney brought together. And the two parties are, generally speaking, they're small C Conservatives and they're Libertarians on the other hand. And this whole issue has just infuriated the Libertarian wing of the Conservative Party. They were never in favor of lockdown measures, at least strong lockdown measures. They want freedom. They don't agree with the current approach of the Kenney government to impose a lot of restrictions. So when Kenney government ministers and MLAs flew off to Hawaii in contravention of the voluntary guidelines, this just made them a little bit crazy. They just couldn't stand it that this kind of hypocrisy had happened, where people who are imposing the rules are now breaking the voluntary rules. And they're not going to get over this fast, it looks like. This really bothers them. So as long as the mandatory rules are in place, as long as those guidelines are in place, this is going to bother their Libertarian wing. And it will only go away for them once the guidelines or the mandatory restrictions are lessened or lifted completely.
Yeah, and we're talking about the travel guidelines that suggest non-essential travel is not recommended at this time versus the guidelines that all of us, sticking around in Edmonton and Calgary and across the province have to abide by, where we can't have gatherings at our house, we can't have gatherings outside. We can't even play a game of shinny at the local rink, right? Now, in response to this, Jason Kenney, he demoted Tracy Allard out of cabinet. He took away committee positions for some of his other MLAs. His chief of staff was shown the door.
David, do you think the government response was an appropriate way to deal with it, or should there have been more punitive measures?
Well, Dave, if it was, the political reality is Kenney had to act. He has a huge part of his base absolutely infuriated. He had to take some action, and he didn't do that quickly enough for them. He didn't, have the correct response initially. I mean, if you ask me what he should have done, I didn't have the same reaction to the libertarian wing of the party, and I didn't have the same reaction as the people who are really focused on protection. My own reaction was that his first reaction was the correct reaction, and the reaction that Mayor Nenshi in Calgary has taken is the correct reaction. That this is just a really tough time for all of us. It's a brutal time, and we're all just trying to get by. And the fact of the matter is, these are voluntary guidelines for Albertans, and travel has been, on a certain level, tacitly encouraged. I mean, we had this whole program in November from WestJet that I didn't hear anyone complain about at the time. There wasn't this huge uproar when WestJet said they were going to enter into this agreement with Hawaii, and Air Canada did the same thing to increase travel there. I mean, what did people think was going to happen? What was going to happen was a lot of people were going to think, hey, it's okay to travel to Hawaii. So with that rule in place, I was okay, and I still am okay with people traveling to Hawaii and taking a holiday. Airline travel is relatively safe. So my own reaction was, I didn't get the hoop. I didn't get the massive anger about this, but I'm not a libertarian, and I wasn't someone really keen on the harshest, most strict restrictions in the first place. So I'm kind of out of step with many Albertans on this. But so I liked Kenney's first reaction, but I also understand why he had to take action to keep his team together in politics. That's how the game is played.
Now, Ryan, from your perspective, what is the case of Jason Kenney being too soft off the hop and then coming around a few days later and saying, okay, I hear everyone's still angry, so I'm going to take action? Was that the mistake that he made?
Well, I think that there are several things. I think David touches on something, and I don't necessarily, I agree with David and I don't. Which is why a lot of people read David's columns, because he finds a way to tick people off and inspire them at the same time. David's right about a few things. He's absolutely right that not a lot of people complained back in November about this partnership, maybe because it flew under the radar a little bit. No pun intended. I have friends that have traveled internationally. I have friends that are traveling internationally as we record this show. And they're posting on social media, and if they're not politicians, they don't seem really either. They seem to be blissfully unaware of the controversial nature of their travel, or they just don't care. They don't care what other people think because they're going to get their trip in. Where I think the breakdown occurs, and David's right, they're voluntary health restrictions. That's a tough sell if you're premier, talking about a cabinet minister or chief of staff. More on that in just a second. But on one hand, you have people that are in Maui right now, sipping on Mai Tais with the sand between their toes. And you have other people, we put our question of the week, our Real Talk question of the week on my website. 4,300 people, more than 4,300 people responded and told us overwhelmingly that they were ticked off about this. One response in particular jumped out at me. A young couple buried their 13-year-old son just last month after a 7-year health battle. The funeral, just the two of them. The young man's grandparents did not attend because they're observing health restrictions. And they're seeing people in Maui. How do you wrap your minds around, and how do you ensure compliance, which we know is necessary? If we're ever going to stomp this thing out and get this over with, we're going to need at some point to take measures that have worked in other jurisdictions. To directly answer your question, why I think people found the premier's response totally unacceptable. Number one, you had government ministers, including the minister responsible for Alberta's emergency management, at a time where vaccine rollout was expected to be the government's top priority, vacationing. You had the premier claiming that I don't believe to this day, because quite frankly, it's unbelievable, that he did not know that his chief of staff was traveling to the UK, a hotspot for COVID. He did not know his senior cabinet minister was traveling, taking a leave for 3 weeks to head down to Hawaii. I don't think Albertans believed it for 1 second. And I think that it reminded people of what turned them off with most recently Premier Alison Redford.
Mm-hmm. Now, was there anything else he could have done that maybe would have tamped down on this anger, Ryan?
Well, I think right now what people are, David touched on it. I think I'm referencing it because I think it's important and because it's something that this is a persistent problem, is that people right now lack clarity on what they're supposed to do. And, interesting story in this past week that the province has been lobbied by WestJet. Now, lobbying is nothing new, and there's nothing inherently wrong with lobbying. Lobbying is part of politics. Lobbying is part of our reality. Lobbying happens, and whether or not the public's aware of it, it's not inherently evil by any stretch of the imagination. And aside from people that may have had their bags lost every once in a while, you're not going to find a majority of people that want to pile on WestJet or hate on WestJet. It's a great Canadian company with a remarkable business model. And so you understand why people feel this disconnect in understanding right now, because on one hand, the Premier, I think probably being influenced by those close to him that were previously working for him, now are working on behalf of WestJet in a lobbying capacity. Premier wants to support WestJet, essentially commends people that are traveling for supporting WestJet at a time when they need our support, while at the same time telling people to stay home. And I think if the Premier could provide some clarity there, which is maybe a tall order, all things considered, people might start to feel like he's exhibiting leadership.
And David, what do you make of that idea of clarity? Do you feel that over the last, I guess we're going on 10 months now, that we've had various measures in place due to COVID-19, that the government hasn't always been clear of what it wants from us or what it expects from Albertans?
I think Kenney's main problem is that you could write it off as mixed messages. I think the problem started right at the start when he kind of talked about this in Churchillian terms about this huge battle that we're facing, invoking the Battle of Britain. And at the same time, he, previous to this whole thing started, he had kind of entered into a big war with healthcare workers over pay with doctors and heading into other negotiations. So when you have this war going on, when it's a big war we're all fighting, but you're fighting with the troops over pay, and there's this huge disconnect over that. Like you shouldn't be fighting with the frontline troops. So Kenney got off on the wrong foot right away in that regard. In terms of winning back confidence, I just think that he's got to play the long game, and playing the long game in this thing is just to try to stick to the right policy, the correct policy. And that may mean actually really ticking off the Libertarian wing on an ongoing basis right now of his party and of his base by having the restrictions in place longer than they would want. If that's the right thing to do, if the goal is to not overwhelm the healthcare system, and that was the goal from day one, that's the most important message we got from day one is don't do that. And so he finally brought in restrictions in December so that wouldn't happen. He's got to stick with that, I think. That's his main message right now. He's absolutely got to stick with it, even if it upsets his own base and his popularity.
So on the idea that he may have to upset some of his base, there's been a lot of talk that there seems to be divisions in caucus about what he should have done or what the rules are. I know that two of the MLAs who had traveled, Pat Wren and Jason Steffen, don't exactly appear repentant over what they had done. And you have MLAs like Michaela Glasgow and even the Speaker of the House upset about the travel. Like, does this speak to possible deeper issues for the Premier, David?
Well, yeah. They're like, as we've been saying this, there's this fault line in their party. To win an election, you have to have a fairly big tent. You have a very big tent. If you're going to get 55% of the vote like the Conservatives did, you're going to have to bring together all kinds of people who don't necessarily agree. And there is this massive fault line that exists within the Conservative Party. And this has just blown it wide open in the short term. So there's no surprise that there's an internal debate going on. Kenney is though the political leader who brought those two sides together. in the face of fairly long odds, and created the UCP. He's the founder of the party. So he does have that going for him. So I think he's going to be able to survive this. There's still, 2 years before there's the next election. He has time to recover from this, but it's going to be a battle. And I think in the short term, it's going to get worse before it's going to get better.
Yeah, and Ryan, we saw premiers get brought down over travel. That's Alison Redford, travel and expenses in her case. And we saw Ed Stelmach forced to resign due to divisions within his own caucus. Are there any lessons here for Premier Jason Kenney?
Well, I mean, I think with both Premier Stelmach and Premier Redford, I mean, to sort of build off what David was just talking about, there were identifiable successors in the mix, and I think that you'd have conversations around which one of these strong sort of front benchers might have the best chance of being the next leader of. I mean, you talked in the context of like who's going to be the next premier, and it would always just be who's on the progressive conservative roster. There wasn't even consideration of anybody with any other party. When you take a look at the current conservative reality, the option here, at least the most viable one in Alberta, the United Conservative Party, I think that if you were to identify anybody that might be a strong candidate to take over as leader, they're probably people that would maybe not feel, but certainly demonstrate or front loyalty to Premier Kenney right now. And I don't, quite frankly, see any compelling minister right now that Albertans would rally behind and say, this is the person that needs to lead the Conservatives forward, and that would also, on the other side, have the gumption or the desire or the chutzpah to step forward and try to stick a knife in the premier's back, metaphorically speaking. So I don't know. I mean, David, talks about riding this out. There's a long, 2 years is forever politically. If Jason Kenney does well on vaccinations, if Keystone XL gets built, if they're able to present some semblance of an economic recovery plan that's palatable to Albertans, if they're able to answer some of the questions that people have about coal mining and selling the parks and these types of things, then perhaps conservative loyalists will forgive them. I'm curious to see that there's not a lot of growth right now, statistically speaking, on what you might see as another progressive, conservative, or centrist option. The Alberta Party has actually dropped in support, if you believe the polls, over the past little while. The NDP's not seen a huge bump up, but the Western Independence Party, that right-wing option, is starting to see the flames flicker again, and that's something I'm sure that Jason Kenney's paying close attention to.
Yeah, and I mean, tied up in all this is the province's response to the pandemic. And if you look at the polls, as you mentioned, Ryan, that a lot of people don't feel that Alberta is doing that great. But if you look at Alberta and compared to other provinces, in some cases, we're faring much better. We have lower per capita deaths than some provinces. We have tested more people per capita than BC and Quebec. And our 7-day case average is lower than some of the biggest provinces in the country. So given all of that, why are we in a position where people are viewing Alberta's pandemic response as poorly as they are? David?
Well, I don't think it's any secret that Jason Kenney's a big target. He is the leading conservative politician from the old Harper gang in the country. So he gets a lot of attention from outside the province in that way. And there's a lot of criticism of anything that goes wrong in Alberta. People have their knives out for the Harper Conservatives. They still do in some parts of the rest of Canada, mainly Toronto. The Laurentian elite that he uses that word scornfully. Well, members of that elite don't like him at all. So they're looking for any mistake that he makes. I think it's really interesting right now that on a certain level, that the fate of both Justin Trudeau and Jason Kenney are bound together over the vaccine issue. They both really need the vaccine, and more so than we all need the vaccine, but politically they need it. Trudeau, it hasn't really become a huge issue for him yet, but fundamentally the federal Liberals are in charge of procurement, and there's almost without a doubt we're going to be far behind a number of countries in the first few months at least. We're going to start to see the United Kingdom, for instance. They're going to have every vulnerable person vaccinated by mid-February. We're not going to get there, it looks like, until sometime in April. So this is going to start to become a bigger and bigger and bigger issue as the death count starts to drop in other countries and ours doesn't for Trudeau. But Kenney also needs to get on the other side of this so he can ease restrictions, justifiably ease restrictions, and he needs Trudeau to come through for him. So they both would like, I'm sure, to rip each other apart politically speaking, but they both need this vaccine thing to work, and Kenney absolutely needs Trudeau to come through. So it's a very interesting position for both of them.
Ryan, looking at the vaccines, and you had mentioned vaccines as well, do you think that if all goes well with the vaccine rollout after a slow start, people might forget or forgive a little bit some of the issues that we've had? Or do you think that, people will view Alberta's response to COVID-19 as in totality of everything that's happened?
Well, first of all, I want to say that to David, and I'm sure he'd agree here, that Jason Kenney may have loved taking shots or identifying the elites in past, but he better be careful invoking that word again, considering he's leading a government that was flying all over the free world through the holidays when people were locked down in their homes. I do think that some of the negative attention or the negative vibes that this government has felt reverberating from the different corners of this province have to do with a couple of key stories. I mean, the government's support of industry, which in the case of beef and specifically slaughterhouses in southern Alberta led to hundreds of cases of COVID-19 early in this pandemic, and what people are identifying as preventable deaths. And I think Albertans quite rightfully have questions about some of the policy and who was advising some of that policy. There's obviously the questions around the competence of the health minister, Tyler Shandro, and some of the negative headlines that he gleaned after showing up on a doctor's driveway. This is in the middle of a pandemic as well. And I think probably, a microcosm of a bigger picture battle that the province has been waging against doctors and nurses. I think Alberta's hesitance to get on the federal tracing app has probably rubbed people the wrong way. I'm not here to argue that any tracing app is superior to another. I don't know enough about them to get into the technical side of the software design or whatever you have. But I think whether it's true or not, people perceived this to be Jason Kenney's spiteful feelings toward Justin Trudeau playing into Alberta's hesitance to sign on to the federal tracing app. And I don't think that Albertans want to see public policy dictated by or influenced by a personal grudge. And I know that because I've heard that from a lot of people that said it just rubbed them the wrong way, that story. So these are some of the reasons why I think that despite some positive numbers, and most recently, most especially on the vaccination front, why the government is still somewhat maligned. To answer your question directly, I think that people have short political memories. And I think that the people that Jason Kenney needs to worry about the most, he's not going to convince NDP loyalists, or he's not going to convince ardent Western separatists to join him in his journey. But the people that are, they voted for him last election, they're ticked off right now. They're putting him in the penalty box, so to speak. If he performs well in vaccinations, if that pipeline gets built, if some of his bets have proven to pay off with regards to tax breaks that they hope lead to jobs and infusions of investment in the province, if that all works out over the next 18 months or so, he can win another election. I don't know if I want to say easily, but potentially easily.
And on that note, we'll wrap things up. You can find all episodes of Under the Dome at edmontonjournal.com/underthedome. Also, don't forget to hit that subscribe button on YouTube. Thanks to my guests, David Staples and Ryan Jespersen. I'm Dave Breakenridge. We'll see you next time.